The sun behind us had dwindled by that time to a tiny disk of fire. An hour later, and another giant world flashed past on our right, the icy planet Neptune, outermost of the 8 worlds. We'd passed outside the last frontier of the solar system and were now racing into the mighty deeps of space with the speed of light on our mad journey to save a universe. Hello, hello. It is Damien, aka Sleepy Book Reader, and this is my very late entry into the beginning of Rocket Summer. That's a event that's supposed to go on throughout July, but I'm starting in late July, so I'm going to go through August. This event was created by Michael K. Vaughan, and the idea is each week of July you read a different era of science fiction. It's supposed to start in pre-1940s science fiction, anything before 1940, and then then the next week 1940s, next week 1950s, and the final week 1960s. So I'm gonna carry all the way through, but it's gonna take me the rest of the summer. I'm not gonna do it during July alone because of this late start. Um, but what I've read so far is books from 1928 to 1931, I believe. I read Crashing Suns by Edmund Hamilton and Islands of Space by John W. Campbell. And what these have in common is both of these are very early space operas. And Crashing Suns could claim to possibly be the one of the two first space operas, because this came out apparently in the same month that The Skylark of Space by E. Doc Smith came out. This came out originally in Weird Tales of all places, and the E. Doc Smith book Skylark of Space came out in Amazing Tales, Amazing Stories, the the magazine that was the center of science fiction at that time, where they eventually got the name science fiction. I think it was still called Scientifiction or something, or Scientific Romances or the like. Um, so I enjoyed both of these books. People look back on this and say that this is junk science fiction, but I really enjoy reading it within context of its time. I mean, they're literally inventing a new view of what you can do with fiction and science fiction, and a new way of incorporating the view of the universe that science has given us into adventure fiction. Behind lay the galaxy we had left, a great swarm of shining points of light, contracting slowly as we sped away from it. Toward our right, too, several misty little patches of light glowed faintly in the darkness, hardly to be seen, though these, I knew, were other galaxies or star clusters like our own, titanic conglomerations of thronging suns dimmed to those tiny flickers of light by the inconceivable depths of space which separated them from ourselves. Of the two, I would say I enjoyed Crashing Suns a little bit more. Um, I appreciated both of these equally, but this is more fun, rollicking adventure. um, it's a series of short novellas or short stories, each one expanding the universe. So in the first one, which is depicted on this cover, I think, or is this from the second story? Now I can't remember for sure. But in the first one, uh, humans have a interplanetary society where they have traveled between all 8 planets in our solar system, and they have a little bit of um, a planetary patrol. And our hero's one of the members of the planetary patrol. Then in the second one, that we've and in the course of the first one, we get the invention of interstellar travel, and which is necessary to save Earth from this sun that's going to crash into our sun, which it turns out some selfish aliens have pointed purposefully at our sun so they can revive their own solar system at the expense of ours. And then in the next one, which involves a sun coming from outside of the galaxy to smash into our sun, we now have a little bit of an interstellar patrol, and eventually they call this the interstellar patrol. Eventually becomes a galactic patrol in later stories, and involves aliens who we're allied with. So we've got bad aliens who who the humans wipe out without compunction because otherwise the humans will be wiped out, I guess. But we also get good aliens and plant people and all kinds of concepts that were just barely germinating, I think, in 1928 when this came out. And then and each story follows kind of the same pattern of the Earthlings or the heroes, when they're a mixture of aliens and Earthlings later, go out, explore this threat, get captured, and then escape. And at the last minute, defeat the aliens and cause and at the very last second, before it's too late, cause avert the big disaster, whether it's destroying a planet or burning up an entire galaxy. Um, and each one attempts to get wilder and wilder and bigger and bigger. We got crazy things like a burning up nebula, which can't really happen, but I don't know if Edmund Hamilton would have known it or cared. Um, but we do, I think, get, especially if you think of yourself as like a kid reading these adventure stories in 1928, we get all kinds of vistas from science opened up for us. The It was only in 1919 that Einstein's theory of general relativity was proved when they looked at the eclipse of the sun and saw light bending. And it's after that that Einstein and his theories became popularly well known. And it was only in 1925, I believe, that Edmund Hubble showed that there were galaxies outside our galaxy, shockingly. Before, we had thought those were all just nebulas, those galaxies. And so I think it takes a while for those things, especially in the age of just newspapers and maybe a little bit of radio. I don't know how much radio there was in the early 20s, but for those ideas to filter through. And so I think it would have been mind blowing to read it back then. And I feel like I can put myself in the context of that. And so there's not much characterization. There's just nonstop kind of activity and action. But there are moments in the writing that really sizzle for me in giving us these new visions. And these are the first authors to do that. "Hold on," called Arcot. "Here we go, if at all." He reached out to the control panel before him and touched the green switch that controlled the molecular motion machines. The big power tubes cut off, and their acceleration ceased. His fingers pushed a brilliant red switch. There was a dull, muffled thud as a huge relay snapped shut. Suddenly, a strange tingling feeling of power ran through them. Space around them was suddenly black. The lights dimmed for an instant as the titanic current that flowed through the gigantic conductors set up a terrific magnetic field, reacting with the absorption plates. The power seemed to climb rapidly to a maximum, then, quite suddenly, it was gone. The ship was quiet. No one spoke. The meters, which had flashed over to their limits, had dropped back to zero once more, except those which indicated the power stored in the giant coil. The stars that had shone brilliantly around them in a myriad of colors were gone. The space around them glowed strangely, and there was a vast cloud of strange violet or pale green stars before them. Directly ahead was one green star that glowed big and brilliant. Then it faded rapidly and shrank to a tiny dot, a distant star. There was a strange tenseness about the men. They seemed held in an odd, compelled silence. Islands of Space was John Campbell jumping very early on onto this bandwagon that Edmund Hamilton and E. Doc Smith have created, and they became kind of the big three of space opera, and he became very popular in the pulps of the early 30s. And he was only 20 years old, um, going to school at MIT and then later at Duke, studying physics, I believe. And this is full of people kind of sitting around and talking, but the people are three young engineering science nerds. And I picture them as like three kids who go to MIT and are at a science fiction convention postulating ways you could have faster than light travel based on the kinds of things you knew about in 1930. And excuse me. and they're practically sitting back and smoking pipes and quipping to each other the way very nerdy science students might quip, who think they're clever and who think they're quite manly. There was a sense of macho-ness about all this. But Campbell gives a fuller kind of sense of all the things you would need to do faster than light travel, at least from a point of view of a young science fan back in 1930. And all of that seems a little boring to us now because we've heard so much of it. But when I put myself in the mindset, I enjoyed this quite a bit too. And once they rocket right out of the galaxy and start taking photographs of their position uh, relative to other galaxies, and then they travel around with this almost instantaneous form of travel that they've invented. You get some pretty cool stuff, including visiting, I think that's what's on this planet here, a planet that's frozen over and dead now because their star died. And they visit cities and see how the very last people of this alien species went to their end in groups, sort of gathered together in buildings. And I think they see kind of evidence of attempts to survive the cooling of their star, but finally they succumbed because they did not have interstellar travel, not to mention intergalactic travel, like in Islands of Space. When they first discovered galaxies, they still sometimes called them nebulas, and they also called them island universes, and so islands of space. And in fact, Edmund Hamilton in the other series, he takes the word universe and uses it in all kinds of different ways. Like your universe is your solar system, then your universe is your galaxy. Um, and then there's island universes of different galaxies. Anyway, so that kind of vision of like a dead planet, that feels very new. I mean, it does kind of connect to things like H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, which appeared, what, 35 years before this. Um, and I do think of Wells as the father of 20th century science fiction in a big, big way. So anyway, you get these kinds of visions that maybe spring out of Wells, but are taken much further. Eventually, we visit here two warring planets within the same solar system. So, so this might be these books, first places with interstellar travel, first places with intergalactic travel. Um, Galactic empires come up in the Hamilton stuff, galactic federations, galactic space patrols, just all these ideas. In here, the idea of two different species battling each other in the same solar system. Um, and you just have to remove yourself from saying, well, I've heard all this before, done better by authors after this. At least for me, that works really well. And it's just amazing to think of this as the bedrock of pretty much all the popular culture, or a huge amount of the popular culture, science fiction, that now permeates the world. They were writing for a teeny audience, maybe 30, 40,000 people. And in ephemeral magazines, this eventually got reprinted in 1956. So sometime in the late 50s, people started reprinting these, but no one knew at the time that anyone would remember their stories after they were first published. But they were in this little world where they responded to each other and started creating what is now one of the most popular forms of pop culture, um, when it was just a tiny little niche. So it really excites me to be reading and talking about science fiction. I didn't get a chance to reread The Time Machine, but I would like to do that. It's very short, so hopefully I'll get to that pretty soon. And I'm pondering for my next books maybe The War Against the Rull by A. E. van Vogt, which is from it's a putting together a fix-up of short stories that he originally published in Astounding from 1940 to 1950. or possibly The Creature from Beyond Infinity by Henry Kuttner. I've never heard of this book before, but Henry Kuttner himself was one of the major 1940s and 1950s, I think, um, writers. This one's from 1940. So, but I also am considering looking in. I'm afraid to crack these open just because they might crumble. But I've got Astounding from December 1947 with a robots and dogs story by Clifford D. Simak on the cover. I'm not sure what else is in here. Um, I've got the October 1948, which is part includes the part of the serial of Players of Null A by A. Van Vogt. Again, he keeps popping up. He produced a huge amount of stuff in the 40s. Yeah, so I'll be back soon with more Rocket Summer and probably hopefully with other videos about other things I'm reading. Talk to y'all later. Below the ship lay the unfamiliar panorama of an unknown world that circled, frozen, around a dim, unknown sun, far out in space. Cold and bleak, the low, rolling hills below were black, bare rock, coated in spots with a white sheen of what appeared to be snow, though each of the men realized it must be frozen air. Here and there ran strange rivers of deep blue, which poured into great lakes and seas of blue liquid. There were mighty mountains of deep blue crystal looming high, and in the hollows and cracks of these crystal mountains lay silent, motionless seas of deep blue, unruffled by any breeze in this airless world. It was a world that lay frozen under a dim, dead sun. At last they came to the outskirts of the dead city. The vertical walls of the buildings were free of snow, and they could see the blank, staring eyes of the windows and within, the bleak, empty rooms. They swept on through the frozen streets until they came to one huge building in the center. The doors of bronze had been closed, and through the windows they could see that the room had been piled high with some sort of insulating material, evidently used as a last-ditch attempt to keep out the freezing cold. Scene after scene they saw. Then they came into a great hall. Here they saw hundreds of bodies, people wrapped in heavy cloth blankets, and over the floor of the room lay little crystals of green. Wade looked at the little crystals for a long time, and then at the people who lay there, perfectly preserved by the utter cold. They seemed only sleeping, men, women, and children, sleeping under a blanket of soft snow that evaporated and disappeared as the energy of the lights fell on it. There was one little group the men looked at before they left the room of death. There were three in it: a young man, a fair, blonde young woman who seemed scarcely more than a girl, and between them a little child. They were sleeping, arms about each other, warm in the arms of death, the kindly reliever of pain. Arcot turned and rose, fleeing swiftly down the long corridor toward the door. "That was not meant for us," he said. "Let's leave."